Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar sponsored by ASPA's section on democracy and social justice, the insurrection at the U.S. Capitol, exploring causes, effects, and ways forward. This event is being recorded, and after reviewing the recording with our panelists, it'll be shared on the section's social media channels. My name is Sean, and I serve as chair of the section. I'll be remaining off camera for the duration of this event, which makes editing the video easier. Let's go ahead and get started because, as we all know, on January 6th, an insurrection at the U.S. Capitol building occurred as members of Congress were certifying the Electoral College results of the recent presidential election. We've already seen numerous underpinnings of this event, what some commentators have called the big lie that election 2020 was fraudulent and stolen, conspiracy theories like QAnon, racism and white supremacy, the erosion of democratic norms, values, and processes, and much more. In this webinar, we're going to explore these dimensions, especially the causes and effects of the insurrection, roles played by racism and white supremacy, actions of law enforcement, and of course, effects on democratic norms and so forth. We're proud to be joined today by four amazing panelists. We have Dr. Susan T. Gooden, who's Dean and Professor of the L. Douglas Wilder School of Government and Public Affairs of Virginia Commonwealth University. We have Dr. Alasdair Roberts, Director and Professor, School of Public Policy at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. We have Chief Ivonne who is the former police chief of Newark, New Jersey, and the police relationships manager of the Center for Policing Equity. And we have Dr. Brian N. Williams, Associate Professor at the Batten School of Leadership and Public Policy of the University of Virginia. So welcome to our panelists. To give everyone a sense of the logistics of the day, we're going to start with some discussion questions for our panelists, and we develop these questions with our panelists before the event. We're going to begin with a question asked to the entire panel, followed by questions for each of the panelists individually. And after each one, I'd invite all panelists to weigh in as they see fit. And if we have time, we'll have Q&A with the audience at the end. Shortly, we're going to be sharing with you a link to a Google form for you to ask any questions or make a comments. And you'll just click on the Google form, fill out the information, and we'll see about asking that. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and we're going to go ahead and get started with the event. And we have our first question for our panelists. And again, please feel free to answer in any order you wish. And what we'd like to ask everyone for our panelists is, could you tell us a bit about what your first impressions were when you learned that an insurrection was underway at the U.S. Capitol building?
So Yvonne Roman here. So it was difficult to imagine that something like that could happen in the United States. I could never have imagined that there would be an insurrection and that they would actually breach the seat of power in the United States, especially on a day like January 6th, where you had a joint session of Congress. You had every elected representative at a federal level in that place. You had the vice president there. And though there were significant amounts of information that there was going to be violence, it was obvious that they were extremely understaffed and not prepared for what was happening. And it's having implications on an international level. The entire law enforcement community is examining what happened there in order to learn how to prevent that in the future.
Yes, I'll follow up if that's okay. Brian Williams, I thought about a couple of different things, maybe 5 or 6 different things. First of all, I thought about a storm, and a storm to me is where kind of atmospheric conditions converge in a place that often disrupts and disturbs one's peace. I thought also about like collisions, and these collisions occurring at the intersections of past and present, but also of expectation and disappointment. I thought about pain. People were hurting and people were hurt. I thought about reckoning with the historic harms of the past and how those historic harms have a presence in the present. I thought about scars, and to me, I was hoping that this would be a scarring kind of event, having a scarring kind of effect, where scars kind of serve as visible reminders of where pain used to be. That scars, to some, aren't necessarily beautiful, but I think they can be a blessing, and I'm happy to kind of talk about that a little more. And finally, I thought about opportunity. Really, where do we go from here? How do we get there? What role could like ASPA play? What role could schools, students, and scholars with a passion and commitment for public affairs and community well-being play? As a professor, I thought about what are the implications for my engagement, service, teaching, and research. So those are my initial thoughts.
And this is Susan Gooden. I'll just be very short. My thought was that America had reached a new low.
Powerful. Thank you.
And I'll just add a few words. I'm going to put in the chat box an op-ed that I wrote recently just about recent events. I think, and I should situate my comments by making the observation that I'm actually a Canadian citizen, so I'm sort of a sympathetic observer of the American experiment. I thought the assault on the Capitol was horrific. The failure of security at the Capitol was truly boggling. And the death of, in particular, the death of Officer Brian Sicknick was a true tragedy, and the ceremony yesterday was deeply moving. The specific form of the violence in Washington on January 6th was surprising, but I think looking at the long run, the fact of political violence itself was not surprising. And I think I'll return to this later on, but one of the difficulties I think that the United States has to grapple with and will continue grappling with is this question of how you cabin or control political violence, how you keep political discourse in the buffers of peaceful contention.
Excellent. Excellent. Would any of our panelists like to follow up on what any of the panelists say before we get to our first question for Dr. Gooden? Okay. So Dr. Gooden, let's start with a question for you. I mean, we're really interested in the research that you've been doing, and especially in the context of your book, Race and Social Equity, a Nervous Area of Government. So given your research, how do you see racism and white supremacy factoring into the lead up to and the aftermath of the insurrection?
Thank you so much, Sean. I've given this quite a bit of thought and wanted to sort of share some of my, I guess, my summary comments. And I would like to frame my comments by taking us back to the Kerner Commission report of 1968. Now, certainly, racism in America is not new. White supremacy in America is not new. But I'm choosing to start this discussion at 1968 because that's when we had the release of the Kerner report and a truly missed opportunity relative to recognizing the harms of white racism and being able to correct it. So just a little bit of brief background in terms of context. The Kerner Commission report was commissioned by then President Lyndon B. Johnson. It came out in 1968. It was in response to the riots that had occurred across the United States in many US cities, including Newark, Detroit, Los Angeles. And so the critique of white racism was not new. W.E.B. Du Bois and others have been talking about the dangers and the negativities of white racism. But what was so important many years before, but what was so important about the Kerner Commission report was that it was the first critique in a US federal report commissioned by a sitting US president. And it was largely a report by moderates. And the quote that I think I wanted to center on today is the comment in the report that what white Americans have never fully understood, but what the Negro can never forget, is that the white society is deeply implicated in the ghetto. White institutions created it, white institutions maintain it, and white society condones it. We've talked a lot over the years about how white institutions create racism and racial inequity. And we've talked a lot over the years about how white institutions maintain it. We have not talked as much about how white society condones it. And so it's this third area, how white society condones it, that I think offers a lot of insights into the insurrections of January 6th, and that we saw on full display then and still in the aftermath. How white society continues to condone racism and white supremacy in the United States. So first, I want to make sure we're all on the same definition in terms of condone. I'm using the working definition. To condone is to accept and to allow behavior that is considered morally wrong or offensive to continue. So you know the behavior is wrong, but you turn a blind eye to it. As Sean mentioned, I've written a lot about race and social equity being a nervous area of government. And I think this flows and is a natural, this also is contained within this framework. Holding white supremacists accountable for racism simply has never happened in the United States. And we don't see any evidence that it's going to happen following the events of January 6th. Why not? Well, because white supremacists, first and foremost, are also frequently problematic friends of the majority. They are the guy down the street, the father, the uncle, the brother-in-law, the father-in-law, the cousin, the veteran who has served our country well, the police officer sworn to protect. So they are racists and supremacists who are also loved and respected. So we want to give them, white society wants to give them another chance to change again and again and again. And we want to give them a pass on their behavior whereby there is really no real accountability, certainly isolated incidents, but no widespread accountability for being a white supremacist. There is simply no structure for this. We do have a structure in this country for providing equality and civil rights. That structure is in place, but the punishment side of racism and white supremacy does not exist. White racism, white supremacy doesn't merit punishment to any real degree. Rather, the tactics that are employed are to, well, let's just put it behind us. Let's move on. Let's move forward. It's shameful. It should not have happened. If we think about lynching, if we think about brutal murders that happened in the 1960s, killings by police in a contemporary setting, there simply is no desire to punish from white society on a large scale. If we look at the Civil War in terms of punishment of Confederate soldiers, it does not exist. So when we look at the history in the United States, there is no widespread accountability for white supremacy. And that's the major lesson here that we've learned again from January 6th. So looking again at January 6th, if we think, for example, of the Proud Boys, just one group, QAnon, there are many others. The Proud Boys have been labeled as a terrorist group in our home country of Canada, but not here in the United States. Why is that important? Well, being labeled as a terrorist group has several important implications. First, there are financial and legal consequences. Secondly, police can seize the property of members. Third, banks can seize their assets. And fourth, it is, and most importantly, it is a crime to knowingly provide assistance to group members. So consequences of terrorists is very different than consequences for racists. But there's no desire to, no political will to name these groups as terrorists in the United States. So these groups that are engaged in white supremacy. So going back to the Kerner report, as I close out, President Johnson, how did that end? President Johnson was furious and did not accept it. He did not accept the report. He thought it was a slap in the face to the work that he had done for the Great Society. He didn't even thank the members of the commission. Roy Wilkins, who was one of two African Americans on the Kerner Commission, who was president of the NAACP, said, and he was quoted later in an interview and trying to understand Johnson's negative reaction to the Kerner report. And he said, quote, "I think probably maybe the word racism, white racism, frightened him. He didn't want to go down in history as the president who had pointed his finger at his own people." End quote. So history has shown time and again that white society simply does not have the will or the interest in punishing white supremacists. White society chooses time and time again to condone it. And that, my friends, is not only a nervous area of government, that is a nervous area of government squared. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Gooden, for those extraordinarily powerful comments. For our panelists, we'd like to encourage any of you to follow up, add your thoughts to this question.
So when we talk about institutional racism, I think as a nation, there's this refusal to accept it, that it exists and that it's baked into all of our systems. Lyndon B. Johnson refused to accept it. And we also have the experience in law enforcement where there's resistance to accept that racism is baked into the system, that law enforcement has historically enforced racist laws, the Jim Crow laws, and bias seeps into a lot of the decision making. And we have to ask ourselves how much of bias seeped into the planning for the insurrection, where when you have a Black Lives Matter protest, there was an overestimation of what was to be expected, right? They planned for the worst. And yet when you have the protest that was occurring with the right wing Proud Boys, there was an underestimation of the risk and they weren't prepared for it, right? So somewhere along that chain, decisions were made that these people weren't going to be a problem, that it could be controlled, that we could handle it with the amount of staffing that we have on hand. And obviously that led to the outcomes that we saw, right? Where there wasn't operational soundness. They didn't have enough officers on hand. They were ill-equipped. It makes people uncomfortable, but there definitely was bias, and it shows in the results that what happened on January 6th.
Fantastic. Dr. Roberts or Dr. Williams, would you like to add to this discussion, to this part? Dr. Williams?
No, there's nothing I'd like to add.
Okay, and we are going to be talking more about ways forward with this with a little bit later, but we'd like to build on this. The question is for you, Dr. Roberts. So you've written extensively on subjects related to crises in democracy, especially American democracy, dissent, authority, and more. I'm thinking about particularly your work for crises of American democracy. And given your work, what central lessons do we see for public administration as a field about the causes and or effects of the insurrection?
Thanks for the question. I think one of the difficulties with the field may be in the field of public administration in the US, maybe that it's taken the fundamentals of governance for granted for too long. That is, we went about studying the field of public administration, assuming that sort of certain fundamental things, internal peace and order, justice, unity, national unity, political stability, could be taken for granted. And so to some degree, we ignored parts of government that were mainly concerned with those aspects of governance. And I actually think it would probably be useful to think of the United States as a fragile state in which you can't take those fundamentals for granted. And I don't think this is a new thing. I don't think the United States is a newly fragile state. I think it's been fragile for a long time. It's sort of fragility is an intrinsic quality of the American state. It's a nation, among other things, that is struggling to consolidate democratic institutions. There is a rhetoric that says that the United States is the world's oldest democracy. By any current or modern conception of what democracy requires, that proposition isn't accurate. The United States didn't become something approaching a fully fledged democracy until the mid-1960s, which makes me older than American democracy. It's obviously still a society struggling to achieve full and equal citizenship. It's also a society that has struggled throughout its history and is struggling today to contain political violence, as I said in the introductory comments. We don't put up monuments to every incident of political violence in the nation's capital, but there are innumerable instances of political violence that could be memorialized in the nation's capital. Multiple shootings and bombings at the White House or Capitol over the last several decades, multiple riots and incidents of mass unrest in the nation's capital that warranted calling out troops over the last century, multiple political assassinations just within blocks of the White House itself. So this problem of cabining or controlling political violence is here today and has always been there in the background. And then finally, that struggle to maintain national unity, that struggle to figure out how to reconcile sharp internal divisions about what national priorities and the role of the federal government should be. So all of those sort of fundamental aspects of governance problems of governance have always been there and are still there today. And they're shared by many other struggling or emerging democracies. And in my own view is that the field, I think, needs to address those larger fundamental problems of governance more squarely and think about the strategies we use overall to manage those problems, and then think next about what kind of administrative structures, what kind of institutions have to be built in order to deal with those fundamental problems.
Thank you, Dr. Roberts. Those great comments. Do any of our panelists have any follow-ups or want to weigh in on this question? Chief Ramon? Sorry, I saw you unmuted.
No.
Okay. Well, and you know, Dr. Gooden and Dr. Roberts, I mean, your comments really nicely highlight just how extensive these crises of governance are, but also that the United States has long struggled with, continues to struggle with issues of racism and white supremacy, and also ensuring the equity and justice within institutions. And Chief Ramon, I think this nicely pivots to a question that we have for you. So, I mean, you served as the police chief for Newark, New Jersey. You've spoken, you've written extensively on representation in law enforcement, and throughout news outlets we've seen just how complex law enforcement actions were before, during, and after the insurrection. And you know, some officers appeared to have supported the insurrection, some form, members of the military, and we have others like Officer Eugene Goodman, who drew insurrectionists away from Senate chambers, you know, being lauded as heroes. So in your assessment, what are some lessons for public administration and law enforcement in general regarding the actions of the Capitol Police before, during, and after the insurrection?
Before the insurrection, there certainly was plenty of information available that violence was to be expected. I happen to be a news junkie, but leading up to this, I wasn't particularly tuned in. I was handling a renovation project in my home, but the few times that I did turn on the radio, it was widely reported that there was going to be a large-scale protest there, that the president promised that it was going to be wild. The president said that they were stealing the election, that they needed to go there and fight like hell. So certainly you didn't need a sophisticated intelligence operation to know that you had to be well prepared for this. So if you're looking at an operation in a race neutral manner, right? You look at what the intelligence is going to be, the scale of the event, and you plan accordingly. You set up a hard perimeter, you set up an internal perimeter. You have officers on standby to supply your officers that you have on the front line if you're not going to have them in the hard gear, right? So there was questions about the perceptions if you put officers out there in tactical equipment, but certainly you can have officers staged at a command post. The officers that are in the soft uniforms, you can instruct them to have their alternate uniforms readily available. So there was a failure on many parts. The chief of police there said that he requested additional support and that he was denied by the sergeant at arms at both the Senate and the House. But those are decisions that were made because of political optics and not based on the information that was available. And that's where I say that bias had leaked into this. There was political influence on how it may look. There was the mayor that requested that the National Guards that do respond, that they not be in the immediate perimeter and that they not have arms. She asked that they stage to help with traffic control a bit further away. And the Department of Defense decided not to have the National Guard on hand because they were worried about the optics, even though the intelligence, right? If you make it race neutral and don't consider who the actual people that are responding, if you just look at the intelligence on what's to be expected and how many people are responding, they would have been better prepared. So this question about how race played into it is definitely pertinent, and it has to be examined so that something like this doesn't happen again.
Excellent, excellent comments. Would any of our panelists like to follow up with that?
I'd like to.
Yes, sir, please.
I thought about that question. A couple of things popped in my head. First was the social construction of targeted populations, right? And we think about that population that stormed, rioted, destroyed our capital. And what's that social construction that allowed them to do so? I also thought about this whole notion that Yvonne talked about, implicit bias. That's at the hope. That's the hopeful position for me, where people will just kind of, those in charge, it kind of revealed their implicit bias. But I also think it was a revelation in terms of white privilege. Imagine, if you will, some negatively socially constructed population in mass at the Capitol. What would have been the response? That's the question that's been kind of really bouncing around my head a bit when I think about people of color in particular, those who are marginalized and kind of historically have been oppressed in those narratives that have kind of continued that level of marginalization and oppression. So I think bias, implicit bias, privilege, I think it was just a very revealing moment, and that could be a good thing. It brought to the light of day the darkness that's within our society. And now it's just up to us to kind of acknowledge it and begin the process of addressing it.
Comments. Any follow-ups to that? Well, Dr. Williams, I mean, your comments and also comments from Chief Ramon and Dr. Roberts and Dr. Gooden have really highlighted again about the importance of police community relations. And one of the things that we've seen, for instance, like Officer Eugene Goodman, a Black officer who drew a largely white crowd away from a group of largely white policymakers. And we see this in the news from commentators talking about, yet again, a Black person putting their body, their life on the line, or the system, and just making sure that this person is celebrated and understood, but also recognizing the historical dynamics there. And that really leads into this next question, because you've written extensively on police community relations. You participated in numerous panels and summit on community policing, including events hosted by federal level entities like the Department of Justice. And your current work is on how law enforcement professionals experience and manage work-related trauma, which we see more and more stories out coming in the news. I believe now 2 officers have committed suicide who had responded to this event. So given what happened during the insurrection, what traumas are some or maybe even some of the officers possibly experiencing, and what needs to be done to ensure their traumas are addressed effectively and equitably?
Thank you so much for that question. Before I really address that question, I'd like to kind of address what you kind of preface that question with when we think about Officer Goodman. The past can have a presence in the present. So I automatically kind of thought about Crispus Attucks and Officer Goodman, right? Defenders of this thing, this ideal that we have in terms of American society, even though they didn't benefit from it. So I think about that selfless service, the sacrifices that they make that are intentional. They're mindful of their status, if you will, but yet for the greater good, they're willing to deny self in the service of others. So I commend them and all officers like them who are willing to do that hard work. But to address your question, in terms of my research and my engagement, I've really come to appreciate the vicarious nature of trauma in the first responder kind of community in general, but in policing in particular. I see many sworn officers and civilian employees, like, let's say, communication officers and dispatchers. They deal with trauma at the personal and professional level. And I've come to appreciate how this trauma compounds, it grows, it accumulates, and it can lead to some kind of productive coping strategies that impacts that officer or that dispatcher, but not only that person, but their families, their friends, their work environment, their unit. And I think trauma that is not addressed is like a cancer. My mom fought a brave, courageous fight with cancer. And one of the things she shared with me is her understanding of cancer. And she said that cancer attacks the good and seeks to destroy it. And it hurts people. And one of the things that we can kind of see, this trauma, this cancer, it hurts people. But what I've come to appreciate too, that hurting people are prone to hurt other people if that pain is not addressed. So to address this effectively and equitably will take some time and some resources, because I think it will require a process that forces all of us to be aware of this insidious problem, to begin the process of trying to understand it, but also ultimately to acknowledge it and its impact on all of us. With this acknowledgement, I think corrective action as collective action can take place, but it requires a collective consciousness by not only the attentive and impacted public, but also the mass and general public, including those first responders like police professionals, and really policymakers, those who can make a difference. I reflect upon, I think, what Colin Powell said years ago, and he basically said, if you break it, you own it. In service to our society and communities, officers, including dispatchers and others involved as first responders, I think they've been broken. We owe it to them and to ourselves to own up to this fact and to resource them at a level that will begin to address the trauma that they face, they experience on our behalf effectively and equitably. Now, I'm only talking about policing. Now, they're first responders. Hopefully we can appreciate too that they're responding to that trauma that's within community. Hurting people hurt people. And I'm hoping that our understanding, our awareness, our acknowledgement of this will lead to some actions where our collective action should speak so loudly that no one can hear us.
Fantastic comments. Does anyone have any follow-up to that?
So I think this incident, like 9/11, really makes you think about the actual officer, right? The person in the uniform that is responsible for handling chaos and crisis. These decisions not to properly staff this insurrection that was planned, the protest, the ultimate cross to bear, right, was on those officers on the front line who had a sea of people surging towards them and had no backup coming, right? And we're starting to see the impact that had on those officers. So we see that policies and implicit bias affects communities, but we don't consider that it also affects those carrying out those orders, those that didn't have any input into the planning, but are the ones that are carrying it out. And we can see it at a really granular level with what's happening with these officers. There's a lot of them out sick. There's serious injuries. A couple suffered brain damage. Two of them committed suicide. So I think that's a factor that's not considered often enough, right? The wellness of the officers and how their wellness impacts how they serve the community and their interactions with the community. And I hope it brings more attention to that.
I'd like to add just a little bit too.
Please.
Right now I'm in the process of working with a couple of others where we're collecting some data, some little piloted study, and it's fascinating. And it's from a state that's, beyond the DC area, but there seems to be a spillover effect, right? Where these officers in this particular state, of course, weren't there at the Capitol, but they feel that pain. They're internalizing that pain. And we have to really acknowledge that it ripples over and it has an effect. I've also been fortunate enough to sit in and observe and participate in a post-critical incident seminar and a couple of other settings where officers have shared their truths, their lived personal and professional experiences as it relates to trauma. And the old saying is, when you see something, you got to say something and do something. Not only did I see something, but I heard something. And that's why I'm trying to say something and do something, because they are hurting. But they've also acknowledged in some of those situations that when they are hurting, there's a temptation to hurt others, including themselves. Until we really acknowledge that and understand that and begin addressing that, not only we're failing them, but we're also failing ourselves. I do think it's possible to make a broken thing beautiful again, but it's a process and it will require, I think, significant resources.
I'd like to jump in here on this
Please.
point. Certainly, the the police officers that were there who protected the Capitol and protected our leaders deserve our respect and were failed by their system in terms of having the backup support. I also think, though, that if the narrative only reflects the sympathy toward the police officers and the aftermath, we've really missed we've missed the boat significantly. There was also a message that has been sent and continues to be sent about tolerance for white supremacy. Keep in mind that the officers were hurt and injured because the white supremacists were able to move forward. These domestic terrorists were able to come forward with an agenda, were able to largely fly under the radar, and were given, all kinds of benefit of the doubt in terms of their attention, their behavior that was likely to ensue. And so what does that say? What does that say? What does it say to communities of color across the United States, as well as to the white community, when there is no accountability, no real will for accountability for the actions and behaviors of white supremacists? And so, it's not just, I think something that all of us, we have to do now is to, get up to date on sort of the new symbols of white supremacy. So for those who might be thinking the KKK and the hood and all of that, certainly that version is yesterday. The symbol of okay, the hand symbol of okay that looks like okay, but really means white power because the lower finger is lowered. That all the shirts that had 6MWE on them, standing for 6 million Jews, wasn't enough by these insurrectionists. And so, I just want to make sure that we are not being limited and the sympathy that we are thinking about in terms of who's been hurt, who is hurting, and what that means for communities of color, and adding insult to injury. I think we want to make sure that we avoid adding insult to injury by not recognizing the pain on these communities as well.
Great response. Any follow-ups?
So when we're talking about the wellness of the officers, I'm talking about those officers immediately there, right? The officers that had to do hand-to-hand with thousands of people. But to the Dr. Gooden's point, absolutely true, right? Those white supremacists have been allowed to fester within police departments. They turn a blind eye. There's some uniforms that have racist patches on them. There was a recent picture that I saw about 2 weeks ago, an officer working on a protest who had a patch on his uniform of a white supremacist group. There's pictures of police officers, SWAT teams with that OK sign where it's down by their leg. Those problems have to be addressed head on, and they have to be addressed firmly, right? It's not a slap on the wrist. Something like that should be an automatic termination, because that leads to a question of your character, who you're going to arrest, how you're going to interact with the community. So I don't think it's one or the other. We have to make sure that the people that we have working, that they're physically and mentally well, because that impacts their interactions with the community. But on the other hand, when you're screening people, when you're hiring people, when you have them on the job, you have to be ever vigilant that the people you're selecting are going to protect the constitutional rights of everyone in this nation.
Okay, that was a great discussion. If you have any follow-ups, please go ahead and do that. For those of you who are just joining, we are having a Q&A with our panelists right now. We've shared a link in the chat to a Google form so you can ask questions. We've actually already received maybe about 12 questions so far. So Teresa and I are working behind the scenes to get to curate these, but we do have one more question that we had asked the panelists beforehand, and this is we'd like all of you to address this if you could, and I think these comments nicely lead into where we're going here, because we see that there are numerous consequences of the insurrection. These include several changes, in court proceedings, discussions of holding elected leaders who may have played a role in encouraging insurrectionists accountable, trial of former President Trump in the Senate, in addition to other charges, and a lot more. It seems like every day we on the news there's some discussion about that, but also this question of who's going to be accountable? How far does that accountability go, if at all? So in your assessment, panelists, what needs to happen now? As conclude a trial, I mean, a conviction of former President Trump in the Senate, or criminal charges of those who are involved, changes to security, legal changes, educational changes, and so forth. I mean, any of your thoughts with that? Dr. Williams, did you want to go first? I saw that you had unmuted.
I can go first.
Okay,
I'm also a little crazy, so I kind of make sure it's working. I'm going to take probably a little different kind of approach to it, but hopefully you guys can kind of follow me, how I've been thinking about it. I think we all have to be accountable. When these things happen, I had to ask myself a few questions. What could I have done to prevent insurrection? What role can I play in getting to the destination of we, that first word of the preamble of our Constitution? And I think that serves as the foundation for forming a more perfect union. Is it possible to be proactive in a coactive way instead of being reactive? The reason why I kind of thought about this from this vantage point is I was reflecting upon my father. He always challenged my siblings and I, first of all, if you're going to point a finger, do so. But first, you got to begin by kind of addressing those three fingers that are pointing back at you, right? So that's why I wanted to kind of look at it. What could I have done? And as I shared early on, I thought we're at intersections, right, of past and present, of expectation and disappointment. And there lies an opportunity for each of us to contribute to when we think about to reimagine, if you will. But in order to reimagine, we have to do some reckoning, right? Reckoning at the individual level, at the professional and communal level, at the institutional, organizational level, at the societal level. We have to reckon with those things that led to the insurrection. And first, we got to kind of recognize before we reckon with those. Now, we all know that February is what? Black History Month. So I thought about Carter G. Woodson. When I thought about Carter G. Woodson, I thought about his book, The Miseducation of the Negro, right? Where he made the argument that Blacks of his day were culturally indoctrinated rather than taught. I think what we witnessed on January 6th was a result of the miseducation of American society. Voltaire said that those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. We had some folks believing some absurdities who committed some atrocities because they were miseducated. And I think our society has been miseducated. As a kid growing up, it always baffled me why we have so many military establishments named after Confederates. I'm from down home Southwest Georgia. That always baffled me. It didn't make sense. And as a kid, I began realizing that, well, Brian, oftentimes those things that are not rational, they are racial. So that's the kind of perspective I'm kind of coming from. So I think this reckoning has to take place across the board. And it has to include within the academy. We must reckon with the notion that one approach to know and to understand is supreme over other approaches to know and to understand. We have to reckon with how we place value on the traditional metrics or criteria that we use to evaluate academics, teaching, research, and service. We have to reckon with, should we place value on intentional and meaningful engagement? Should we incentivize that? We have to reckon with the question, is institutionally credentialed knowledge enough? We have to reckon with so many different things that really gets at these issues that are at play right now. So we're at this reckoning and kind of reimagining moment, which I think is very, very productive and constructive, but it will take a process. Going from, once again, this awareness, understanding, acknowledgement, and then ultimately to this corrective action as collective action. So yeah, I wanted to I think about, there's a lot of blame to go around, including myself and the profession that I'm affiliated with. But as an optimist, that's why I like this whole thing about, I'm hoping it will have a scarring effect, a visible reminder of where pain used to be. And if we appreciate the beauty of the scar, what we can do is try our darndest not to get scarred again. How do we learn from the mistakes? because this is a teachable moment. Much like Susan spoke about earlier with the Kerner Commission, that was a teachable moment. The President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing was a teachable moment. The Wickersham Commission in the late 23rd, teachable moment when we think about police community relations. The problem is we fail to learn. So we have to do our best to teach. So I challenge all of us to put some skin in the game, to kind of make a difference in our own kind of respective spheres of influence. Sorry for my rambling, but I'm pretty passionate about this topic. And I got kids, and one day I hope to have grandkids. And I do hope this space in place will be a much better space in place once they get to my stage of life.
Thank you. Dr. Roberts, did you want to go next?
Sure. I think, obviously there has to be accountability for the events leading to the insurrection itself. I think it's probably also useful to recognize that the insurrection is not the problem. It's a symptom of bigger underlying problems. And, a lot of us are engaged in the teaching of people who are getting ready to go into public service. And I think, one of the implications is that we should probably do a little reframing of the way we think about that process of educating folks. The basic question is, how do you govern in a racialized, divided, and often violence-prone society? And how do you get the fundamentals? How do you get order and peace, but also justice? And sometimes we haven't addressed those fundamentals as directly as we ought to have done. We could look at what other societies grappling with the same problems have done. There's an opportunity for learning from abroad. What have they done to achieve peace, justice, truth, reconciliation? It's also possible to look back at American history and look at how Americans in the past have approached these problems, well or badly. And I do think that one of the difficulties here in the field is a sort of lack of historical consciousness, a lack of understanding of the way things have gone before, inability to see trends or parallels between previous moments in American history, a lack of a sort of breadth of view. One of the interesting things about the last 20 years has been the number of instances in which people have been surprised by bad stuff that happens. Surprised by 9/11, surprised by Hurricane Katrina, surprised by the global financial crisis, surprised by the pandemic, surprised by the insurrection. And one of the reasons I think that we're constantly surprised is that we have such a weak grasp of history, because anybody looking at the long run wouldn't have been surprised by any of these things. So I think part of the solution, aside from getting back to fundamentals, is a breadth of view and a historical perspective as well.
Fantastic. Do you have any other comments on this question about going forward, what needs to happen next?
I think that there's a question, right, about legitimacy, right? When we talk about fairness and justice, right, and accountability, right? Does it apply to the powerful or just to the little people, right, who don't have connections, who don't have deep pockets? So we've seen many arrests related to what happened on January 6th, but we know that those weren't lone wolf people. We know that they were indoctrinated, that they were subjected to propaganda, that they were whipped into a frenzy, right? So the case could be made for conspiracies, right? There was a mastermind. There weren't people acting on their own, right? So does accountability and justice just stay at this lower level, those people who went in, or are we going to hold those accountable who actually generated the movement towards this insurrection, right? And I think we're all waiting to see, if we talk about justice, if it's truly legitimate, right? Or is it just going to be a couple of sacrificial lambs to say, well, we held people accountable, when we all know in reality, those responsible for bringing thousands of people into DC to march on the Capitol and fight like hell are held accountable.
Fantastic.
So I'll weigh in. You know, I'll start with thinking about the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag that, you know, many of us learned being educated in the United States and said every day in school. So it starts off, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands. I think we have to really interrogate, what do we stand for as a republic? What are those values? We say that we value equality. We say that we value all people being created equal. We say that we believe in liberty and justice for all. But do we? Do we in our manifestation of our policies and our accountability structure? Does our republic stand for white supremacy? That is a question we have to answer. If it does not, then we have to have the infrastructure in place to be clear that our republic does not stand for that. And so we have to have an alignment and a squaring of the values of the democratic values of the United States. And we have to, this is a critical moment. I completely agree. This is a critical moment. This is a critical moment to really examine the difficult topic of white supremacy and to decide as a nation and as a community, is that a part of the republic for which we stand? And if it is not, then we have to eradicate it.
Do any of our panelists have any follow-ups to that?
Yeah, this is something I just, in the context of white supremacy and trying to maintain that white supremacy. This is something that caught my attention too, that is kind of brought back to the surface some things I've been thinking about. In order for white supremacy to kind of continue to be maintained, you have to manufacture and remanufacture it. And if we think about the demographic shifts that have been occurring, and we look at some of those insurrectionists who are radicalized, there were some brown folks, there were a few black folks. And that's always led me to kind of think about, how do we, our society, remanufacture whiteness, generate new whites, right? And I think about that in the context of history. About 20-something years ago, International Communitarian Summit in DC, one of the keynote speakers was a Jewish fellow. And he said in 1999 that he could never imagine, as a kid growing up in New York, that he would be considered white. And I think about that in terms of, you know, to really kind of understand, address, and to deal with white supremacy, we might have to really begin interrogating this notion of whiteness and how it can kind of change over time, being somewhat inclusive, but yet still exclusive. And how do we kind of address that? That might take us a different little path, but that was just something that was triggered based upon Susan's comment. I'll kind of wrap up my comments to this question too. I think about the ASPA Code of Ethics too, right? This is an ASPA event. And we look at the sequencing of what we're called to do: advance the public interest, uphold the Constitution and the law, promote democratic participation, strengthen social equity, fully inform and advise, demonstrate personal integrity, all of those things that are listed. Then I think there was some failure, right? Within the profession, right? But also within the world of politics. And there's some costs and consequences with our failures. And I'm hoping that we can learn from the mistakes and kind of grow from them. Because some things you can quantify, other things you cannot quantify. And when we think about people losing their lives, that's a void that can never be filled. So I really challenge each of us to do what we can to really address these issues that have emerged.
Fantastic discussion. And any follow-ups to that? Parisa, our intrepid social media editor, digital engagement coordinator, has posted the ASPA codes of ethics. We encourage everyone to look at that. Also noting that both serving the public interest as well as the Constitution and promoting social equity are all provisions of that code, things that are referencing. So just really quickly, we'd just like to remind everyone that we do have a form for our Q&A portion. We've actually already received quite a bit of questions and comments. Parisa and I have been working behind the scenes to determine which ones we want to ask. There's some for each of you individually. There's some for the panel. And Parisa and I would actually like to start with this question, which is for the panel. Some version of this question was asked quite a lot, but we're using one version in particular. And the person who asked this has asked us to ask it on their behalf. For the panel, what contradictions in values do you see? For instance, we see people who claim to love the police attacking them. We see a total lack of accountability. It's seeming that many people are simply going to get away with what they did, and that to even ask for accountability comes with claims that we're apparently sowing division. And so the person asks, what are the consequences of these contradictions in values to a democracy, and how do we go forward? So quite a few broad questions that are linked together, but all about these apparent contradictions in values and effects on democracy and how we go forward. Would really welcome your thoughts on that. Anyone on the panel?
Let me say this. You know, I do think it's we have seen in the context of the pandemic some of the most encouraging signs when we talk about public policy and fairness and equality. Some things that before the pandemic, we would have never even thought about. I mean, things about, for example, early release of prisoners who are nonviolent offenders, re-looking at those policies, looking at fairness and how we admit students into school. Do we really need the GRE and standardized tests? You know, I could go on and on and on, you know, being able to provide an opportunity for people to pick up their groceries so that members of the community who are differently able don't have to go inside and shop and work and be able to work from home and to telework. Many things that members of the differently abled community have advocated for years and years and years and years. So we've seen that when there is political will, we should not underestimate the power of political will. When there is political will to pull together, to work toward a common vision, then a lot can happen in a very, very short period of time. Many of the things and the policies that have, you know, come into place just over these few short months, and many of those were in place, you know, within 60 days of the start of the pandemic. You know, we would have never thought about those years before without multiple studies, a lot of fights, you know, political fights, being able to provide resources, economic resources directly to families that are hurting and unemployed and really struggling. You know, making sure that people are protected from being evicted from their homes and those sorts of things. Many of those policy ideas are not new. They're not new. We simply had the political will to implement them. And so if we have the political will to say, we as Americans in society, our democratic values, our democratic institutions, there is just simply no place for racism and for notions of white supremacy. If we have that will, then just like we've seen these major accomplishments that we've seen in a lot of other policy areas, we can have that, we can see that those same changes take place as well. So I'm optimistic in terms of the ability to do it and the ability to do it quickly. We just have to have a mobilization of political will in which to accomplish it. And then we can accomplish things in heroic speeds that we may have thought impossible. And, you know, I always say, those of you who know me well know that my favorite quote, one of my favorite quotes is from the late Nelson Mandela. And Mandela says, when he was talking about the end of apartheid in South Africa, he said, it always seems impossible until it's done. So we might think it's impossible to really have a society, a democratic society that is not based on notions of racism that are ingrained, white privilege that goes unchecked without accountability. We may think, there's no way that we can do these things, but we can be a republic that stands for common values. We can be a republic that that believes in equality and that all people are created equal, and that we reflect that in our policies. We can achieve outcomes and reverse outcomes where we don't see the same patterns, whether we're talking about housing, education, criminal justice, health care policy, where it's always the same pattern where whites fare better than communities of color. We can do that. We can do that, and we would end up with a much stronger, vibrant democracy and republic. But we have to have the political will to do it. And so, like Brian, I'm optimistic about the opportunity. This is a huge opportunity, and I just want to see us as a society make the most of it.
If I could just pick up on the question of political will a bit, the insurrection, this sort of symptom, showed up on Capitol Hill, but it might be that the solution to that problem doesn't show up on Capitol Hill. It might be that you have to go look for solutions to the underlying problems in different venues, lower levels of government, state government, local government, for example. I mean, one of the predicaments at the federal level is that the country is deeply polarized. There are profoundly different views specifically on the question of what the federal government should do. And that means there's going to be a certain level of dysfunctionality at the center for the foreseeable future. And so, the prospects, we might wish that the federal government was the principal agent for fixing the problem that was made manifest on January 6th, but it might be, as a practical matter, that the solution is going to have to be sought in other places as well.
Any further comments on that?
So I think our 2020, 2021 has definitely given us opportunities to see how damaging the current polarization is, right? These different camps, and they're so entrenched in their beliefs. But what this past year and a half has taught us is that if you want to learn, you can actually see what systemic discrimination does, right? What racial inequalities do, right? In the way that the insurrection was handled, right? Definitely would have been different had the group that was protesting been different. The same for COVID, right? The way that this has been become a political issue, that whether you believe or not in COVID and what it does depends on your political affiliation, right? But then even looking at who's it's affecting, right? I am Latina. I know 7 people that died from this disease, and all Black and brown. I myself was hospitalized for 8 days, but yet I live in a white neighborhood where my neighbors don't believe that it's as serious because it hasn't affected any of them personally. So definitely what has happened in the past year and a half, if someone wants to learn, if someone wants to realize what systemic discrimination is, you have viable examples, learning lessons that you can, or you can decide to remain willfully ignorant, but it's not for lack of opportunities to learn.
Excellent comments. Any other follow-ups to that? Really great discussion. Okay, this next question is directed to Dr. Roberts, but of course all of our panelists, please feel free to weigh in. And this question is particularly about healthy society and democracy. And the question is, how could we have a healthy society and a democracy when conspiracy theories like QAnon people end up believing so easily?
Well, you can't have a healthy society and as long as you've got conspiracies like that prevailing. I mean, I don't know what more to say on that point.
And it's mind blowing, right? Like rings in pizzerias are kidnapping children and peddling them, right? Just the absurdity of it, right? And so if that's what they want to believe, like, how do you? I'm at a loss.
Okay, maybe I can pick up. I mean, there's sort of 2 points here. I mean, can you have a healthy society when a significant part of the population believes these things? No. But then the practical question is, how do you govern a society where a substantial part of the population does believe those things, right? How do you move forward? Having posed a question, I'm not sure I have a neat answer, but that's the predicament. And it's not something that gets fixed overnight. You're not going to persuade a substantial part of the population that's acquired a certain fixed set of views to change their minds overnight. And so is sort of the question is, how do you govern and how do you slowly kind of shift the boat over time?
Great. I mean, we did have quite a few questions in the chat about the role played by QAnon, and a lot of them were in that context that you answered, Dr. Roberts, as well. Is, you know, how do we move forward when something like this is believed so easily? Again, a version of that.
Okay, actually, do you mind if I apologize for interrupting, but I can pick
up
on that
please.
As well. You know,
Please,
this is one
do.
of these instances where looking back at history actually would be helpful, because this is not entirely an unusual phenomenon. I mean, if you go back and look at the mid 19th century, you had large chunks of the population that were operating on, you know, views of the world that were ill-informed or misguided or malicious as well. And you know, the notion that everyone is feeding off the same professionalized mainstream media is very much a mid 20th century notion. So this is one of these instances where you can go back and sort of say, okay, what happened the last time we were in a boat, kind of like the boat we're in now?
Well, and that raises another question that I think nicely leads into what we've been talking about, and this is for the whole panel, and it's actually specifically about the role of education. So the comment was, you know, how has public service as a profession been negatively impacted by these disastrous events, and what can we do up to and including in education to correct the negative impact of the nation to ensure that good civic-minded citizens go into the profession?
I'd be happy to jump in with that. We've talked a lot about that at the Wilder School, and I think it has really tremendous implications for the field of public affairs. And I know that this DSJ section is part of the American Society for Public Administration. The expectations and the work before us as a field have never been more important. And, you know, the notion of being able to train the next generation, tomorrow's generation, today's generation, about principles of good government is very, very important. And this is a sobering moment. You know, in our school, we have the disciplines of public administration, criminal justice, homeland security, emergency preparedness, urban affairs and planning, and public policy. And the implications for each of these areas is huge right now. I mean, look at the work that we are looking for. We're turning toward federal, state, and local government to address, you know, the pandemic. I mean, just the health issues, public safety issues, education. How are we going to, you know, offset the learning loss that has happened over the past year and continues to happen? I mean, there are just huge implications, and it has never been more imperative for us as a field to attract the best and brightest, the most talented, and those who have a deep commitment to the realization of a constitutional republic. It is just, it's daunting. But I think that the good news is, I know that we have a lot of great people who are willing to roll up their sleeves and work. public administrators, we are responsible for delivering on, implementing, evaluating public policies and approaches. Also in advisory capacity, leading the way in terms of plans and proposals and decisions. There is a lot of work out here to be done. Really, really important work. I don't think in the past we've really thought about ourselves as a life or death field. I'll say that. I don't think we thought of ourselves necessarily as that. We are now. We are now for sure. And, all the implications that are happening in terms of dealing and addressing with the issues today have tremendous implication for public affairs. So it's a very important and critical time for us to lead.
One thing we can do as a community is take a stand. And I'll elaborate on what I mean by that in a moment. Just sort of explain what it is we stand for. Many of us work in NASPA member universities, member programs. Many are in NASPA accredited programs. NASPA has accreditation standards. Why don't we make a commitment to democracy, the rule of law, and human rights in the accreditation standards? I've posed this question several times and have never really got an answer to it. This seems to me to be a pretty straightforward proposition. It's not shouldn't be a point of contention. Why don't we just basically say that the core public service values that programs that are participating in NASPA should sign up to include these fundamentals about human rights that the United States as a nation signed up to 80 years ago when it became signatory to the UN Declaration of Human Rights.
I'd like to offer a comment as well to this question. In terms of the role of education, I think it can play a very vital role in terms of creating a counter narrative that really has, when we think about the dominant narrative today, where government is not the solution, but government is the problem, that has been kind of echoing about for decades. And so now we have folks who are within our government who are extremely, almost, I can kind of see being anti-government. So there's a pipeline opportunity if we, I think, invest in much more civics education from primary, secondary, post-secondary kind of education, where people can kind of really have a true understanding and get beyond some of those contradictions and values that person asked a question about. When we think about what does it mean to be an American? What does it mean to be a patriot, right? And how, oftentimes we got to kind of look back to appreciate the patriotism of a Dr. King, right? The patriotism of a John Lewis. We celebrate Dr. King now. We're thinking about putting a statue up for John Lewis at the Capitol. But yet we go back 3 or 4 decades, literally, people tried to kill them and successful in killing Dr. King. So how do we really invest in education? That's why I want to kind of talk about this miseducation of American society. We've missed the mark. And the old saying is, you reap what you sow. Chickens come back home to roost. And that's our reality. But also we have to appreciate the reality that what we're wrestling with, I don't think will ever go away. It's embedded within the soul of our society. So I don't care what's planted in that soil, everything that comes up will be contaminated, but we can mitigate it, but we have to first kind of acknowledge it. So I think education plays a vital role, but we have to reimagine this thing called education and the process that we take with it. Again, tapping into that tacit knowledge, that knowledge that resides within community, that deeper understanding of these real issues. Because, I think about Ralph Ellison in The Invisible Man, right? Those insurrectionists who were radicalized were invisible, I think, to a lot of folks. They're in pain. And I think Dr. King said something about protest and riots. It's people in pain, they speak, they express that pain, they release that pain. We're aware of it now. We have to address it. And I think education can play a major role in doing so.
Could I pick up on what Brian was saying too? I just want to sort of affirm his point that, you know, as I was saying earlier on, fragility is baked in. You can't take things for granted. And, you know, if you just started from that proposition, you sort of change the way you think about education, the way you think about training for governance. But, you know, there's also going to be a major project of socialization in the United States over the next 20 or 30 years. Over the next 3 decades, there are going to be more than 150 million new Americans arriving, just because of population growth and births and arrivals and so on. The estimated population of the U.S. is going to be about 438 million by 2050. So, you know, and when you just look at the increase in population over the next 25 years, that exceeds the total population of the United States 100 years ago. So it's like you got a new country arriving, and there it is, and they've got to be socialized. You know, they've got to be told, they've got to have the sort of core values inculcated, and that is going to be a major challenge for our profession as well over the next 25 years.
I'd just like to add. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Yvonne.
Oh, thanks. So I've been thinking about the importance of having a well-informed electorate. In 1949, we had what was called the Fairness Doctrine, and it required the major broadcasters to give media and news in a fair and an impartial manner, right? So it couldn't be one-sided. It's not like now where we have these echo chambers. You have either CNN or Fox News that gives the news with their slant, right? Before it had to be down the middle, right? Where if you had, let's say, a Democrat, you had to have a Republican for point, counterpoint. And that led to having a fairly informed electorate. Right now, we have people that are getting their information in silo chambers and echo chambers, right? And it's reinforcing conspiracies and us versus them. I would really love for the FCC to revisit that. It was vetoed in 1989, I believe, by Ronald Reagan. But really, I think we're seeing the ramifications of having a really misinformed or uninformed populace, right? So not everyone has advanced education, but everyone has access to the internet, and they're getting their news from places that either not verifiable or the information is biased. We really have to have a way to provide information to Americans that is news, right? That it's not propaganda or rumors or centered around a specific ideology.
Dr. Gooden?
Trying to unmute myself, sorry. Thanks. I just wanted to make a few comments here in this space. One, I think there is an opportunity for a call for national action that is nonpartisan, but really goes back to values of a constitutional republic, and being able to have those values that are not partisan, I think is a starting point. You know, when I think about the challenges of the day, and I think the United States and how we're faring in the coronavirus pandemic is really representative of a larger problem. You know, we look at areas like Australia or South Korea or Taiwan, New Zealand, areas that have a much better hold and handle on the coronavirus. What has happened there that has not happened in the United States? There is a unification. There is an acceptance of these are the key principles that we need to implement in order to reduce risk for everyone and for everyone to have a better health outcome. We do not have that now in the United States. And what are we doing? I mean, what do we see as the manifestation of that? We see, people of all walks of life dying, becoming infected, sick. I mean, I think in some ways we're seeing the coronavirus, and although it is disproportionately impacting Black and Brown communities, it's impacting everyone. I was on a call just literally before this, where a white male in our provost office was talking about how his daughter has it, his mother died from it. And he's concerned about his mother-in-law who's living in their household getting it now. And, and these individuals are all white Americans. So, I think what we're seeing is the lack of unity, the lack of being able to have sort of commonality and convergence around national principles or a national plan to act. We're seeing the manifestation of the shortness of that, and that's not a sustainable, viable strategy. It's not a strategy that's going to work with the coronavirus. It's not a strategy that's going to work in terms of security and peace. It's not a strategy that's going to work in terms of being able to limit insurrections and to tap those down. It's not a strategy that we're going to be able to use in order to move forward as a country based on premises of equality. So, it's ironic, really, that the things that are happening before us, but I think it's also very revealing that the path of, sort of, I guess, rugged individualism, for lack of a better term, and the abandonment of community values and national values, comes with a very, very high price. And I think that it has become something that the United States simply cannot afford.
Any follow-ups to that? It's a great discussion. Okay, so I think this is a nice segue into one more question. We have about 9 minutes left to our event. Just again, thank you for everyone who's been making questions and comments. I think we had about 60 actually asked behind the scenes. So we've been doing our best to try to get the ones that appear the most often, but there's something here that quite a number of times came up, that linking education and training and giving advice. And so we're actually borrowing from a few different questions here, but it's essentially this. We see vastly different government responses regarding protests, advocating for Black Lives Matter, and also the insurrection. If you had to give a piece of advice to government, how do we make public service institutions, whether policing or bodies like Congress or anything else, accountable for racism and white supremacy and foster fairness for all? Quite a big question, but it came up quite a lot.
I think we have a lot of structures, I think, that are in place. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is GARE, the Governing Alliance for Racial Equity. And that work has been going on at least back to 2004. Some of the precursors of the work, and then it started, a lot of cities have really sort of bought into these principles, and I won't go into the framework. Maybe someone can put in the chat the Governing Alliance for Racial Equity sort of website, and folks can take a look at that. But there are lots of great proposals out here in terms of what we need to do to move forward to a society that's based on racial equity and what that means for government, how we implement that. One of the things that we've seen, if we put up just even a map of, not to say that those cities who have signed on board are perfect by any means, but at least that there is an awareness and a willingness to engage in these conversations, to try to move the needle and to understand the importance. The good news is that we have more cities that are becoming GARE cities. The bad news is if we put a map up of those cities, it's very geographically concentrated. And I'll say we have very few in the US South. So when you see those dots in the map, they're primarily in the Northwest, in the Midwest, and in the Northeast. So that's an issue in and of itself, but it's not a resource issue. And I know oftentimes as educators, that's the first thing that we say, that, there aren't plans out there. We need this, I don't think it's a lack of plan, a lack of tools that are out there. It really does come down to will. And there's no real good substitution for that.
I'd like to add to that what Susan said, if I may. Thinking about that question, I reflected upon some of the work I've been doing for the past 25 years or so, primarily with a lot of police departments, and quite frankly, a lot of police departments going in to train where I might have been the only person of color in the room. And what I've come to appreciate is that process matters. And I've come to appreciate that you have to meet people where they are and not where you want them to be. And once you kind of acknowledge that, you know, we see the world based upon our limited life experiences, you know, our intersecting kind of identities. But we're human and we have that growth potential. And what I've come to do is kind of utilizing, I said I'm from down home, the old saying, can you boil a frog, right? And you can, but it's a process. If you put a frog in hot water right away, that frog will jump out. But if you put that frog in some decent water and then gradually increase its heat, you can boil it. And that's the approach I've taken in terms of trying to get folks to appreciate the lived experiences of others that challenge their own within the profession of policing, but also within communities too. It's a process that can work, but you have to be intentional. You have to be mindful of where people are, and but also you got to be hopeful that they're human, that they can grow. But I think process matters as well.
Dr. Roberts or Chief Roman, any thoughts?
I'll defer to Chief Roman for the moment.
Okay.
So when we're talking about accountability and then consequences, I think the easiest way, right, to get compliance is to attach it to dollars, right? So grant funding, any kind of support tied to where they're at in reaching specific metrics when it comes to racial equity and equality. You could, for police departments, tie that to any kind of federal funding, right? Any COPS grants, any grants that are coming out of the Department of Justice. Have where you have to meet certain metrics within your policing practices, the representation of your department to qualify for certain programs. That's the most, I guess, the easiest way to get compliance if it's a federal level priority, right? Treat it as a priority.
And I think, you know, one of the objectives is accomplishing full and equal citizenship. And you get that principally through advocacy and mobilization at all levels of government. I think recognizing that in the short run, the capacity of the federal government to take action boldly to remedy problems is going to be constrained by the underlying politics. The other observation I think I would make is that this is going to be, you know, the big question for this century is, does democracy work? We sort of took for granted 20 years ago that it was obvious that democracy worked. We're now in a very different world where the world's biggest economy is an authoritarian state. Democracy's on the back foot. And the question is, can you make a society that's democratic, that's peaceful, that's unified? And I think the one observation I would make is that, you know, the U.S. isn't alone in this. There are lots of other democracies out there that are just engaged in this struggle to create unified, peaceful, just societies. And this is a real opportunity for the U.S. not to go abroad preaching about how to do things, but actually to join with other democracies and figure out how you achieve justice and make democracy work.
Fantastic, fantastic. So we actually have less than 2 minutes left, and we just like we probably could ask another question, but we don't want to risk it, so we'll go significantly over. But I'd just like to give this opportunity for our panelists to make any final statements, any final thoughts, any words of advice about anything regarding this topic. If you'd like to take a go at that.
Thanks, Sean. First of all, I'd just like to say thank you to the Section on Democracy and Social Justice and to the American Society for Public Administration for having this panel. And thanks to all the audience and the attendees and my fellow panelists. I really appreciate all the perspectives and being a part of this. And, you know, I would just say as sort of as a final comment that, you know, doing this work is not easy. And it is uncomfortable and it is emotionally laden and it does invoke nervousness, but it's important work to do. And so panels like this and discussions like this are critically important to achieving our overall goal here of having a democratic society, of having a society that's free of racism. that's really important. And conversations like this are a great step in the right direction. So thank you.
Thank you.
Ditto.
Agreed.
Okay.
Likewise, I think it's just, I'll just thanks once again for everyone who made this happen, who also participated in observing and asked those questions. But let's put some skin in the game. Let's kind of leave this place better than how we found it. And it's good to see each of you and to hear of you. And we got some work to do, so let's get to it.
Excellent, excellent. Well, thank you everyone for attending. Thank you to our 4 amazing panelists, Dr. Gooden, Dr. Roberts, Chief Ramon, Dr. Williams. We're going to be reviewing the recording with our panelists, and then after review and approval, we'll post a copy on our social media. And as we close all of our events, as something that is also in DSJ's bylaws, let's just remember it's our common responsibility to understand how unjust systems come about, to dismantle them and replace them with systems that promote equity and justice for all. As the insurrection showed us, we have a long way to go, but we must act. When we create a society just for all, we're living up to public administration's highest purpose, to improve people's lives.